Welcome back to another one-on-one with Jerry Hall. Today's conversation is with investor extraordinaire, Mr. Greg Kidd. We're going to talk about the investor mindset. I mean, obviously, we have to address GlobaliD and some of the other companies that Greg is invested in, but a majority of our conversation is going to be around how to think as an investor, how to analyze and look at risk. Where did some of these thinkings come from? Obviously, there's a lot to learn from this man. This may be one of these interviews you watch a couple of times. I know I'm going to. It was jam-packed with gems and nuggets. Well, enough for me. Let's get to that conversation. It's coming up right now. So Greg, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. How are you?
I am fine. Thanks for having me.
No, it was such a joy to hear back from Alec and get this arranged. A gentleman like yourself, there are so many topics that come to mind that I want to discuss, but I don't think we should start with anything other than what's prevalent right this minute, and it's right on your background. It's called GlobaliD. Let's jump into obviously, you could spend a lot of time doing anything. Why GlobaliD? What was it that you said, okay, this is something that I need to do?
Well, there's all these new technologies in the world, with like blockchain being the most prevalent. And you can have all these ledgers, whether it's for the Bitcoin or a blockchain ledger for diamonds or any other asset, houses. But if you don't have an identity to sign that with, you're not going to have a solution that's going to be compliant. Yes, it would be technically proficient and correct, like anybody who had that private key could speak for that asset, but that's a Mad Max world. In a Mad Max world, if you got the bigger gun, you get the thing you want. But in a world of law, which we still have a bit of, you need to actually be not just authenticated, which is what the private key is, but actually authorized legally. So if somebody has taken your private key from you because they kidnapped you or put a gun to your head, yes, technically they can conduct the transaction, but that doesn't make it a compliant transaction. And so the idea of GlobaliD is to have a system where each of us has an identity. It doesn't belong to a corporation. It doesn't belong to a government. And we have a way to authenticate and authorize ourselves. And we have all these other people that are in our community that vouch for us. It's a web of trust. And so you don't have to go back to a central authority. So GlobaliD, it complements the new permissionless blockchains by creating a form of trust that's portable and not beholden to a single corporation or a single government. And in particular, just to describe GlobaliD, it's like a namespace for identity. So just like the World Wide Web was built on a global protocol that gave every website a name, made it easy for individuals and businesses to use the internet, GlobaliD is the same thing. So just like there's a namespace for Skype or Twitter, we all get names, they're unique, that's our public key, and anybody who adopts this technology, it's an alternative to kind of the Facebook Connect world of logging in. But the difference is, with Facebook Connect, you're not going to log in compliantly and be able to hold and move money around because they don't have a system for building up a trust network that the people that are actually using Facebook Connect aren't robots or imposters. With GlobaliD, it lets people collect, like an Easter egg hunt, enough verifications to be trusted in the eyes of the other party that you're doing business with. And so to me, without a form of GlobaliD, we can't get into that Star Trek future where Romulans, Cleons, everybody can buy dilithium crystals. So there's clearly some future identity and ledger system that works across the various universes. And we're missing those intermediate episodes that explains how we got to that future. And that's what GlobaliD is really working on.
Well, when I read about it initially, I thought to myself, okay, this has a far-reaching, a far reach. It has a huge reach. And so I immediately went to GlobaliD. I secured Jerry V. Hall. So it's taken, folks. For those of you out there that think you're going to swoop on it, I'm sorry, it's already taken. And what I thought to myself, I thought, okay, this is incredible because what I saw in my head, and correct me if I'm wrong, if it's part of the vision or not, is that this could literally be my authentic, verified digital signature for just about anything that I would have, that I would do digitally, whether it be the transmission of value, whether it be money from one place to another. How about starting a new account somewhere? Oh my goodness, the rigmarole that you go through with each new site. You're doing 25 different things with every single one of them. How nice would it be if that site said, do you have GlobaliD?
Yep.
Oh, well, as a matter of fact, I do. Click. Oh, hello, done.
Right.
Right? So I have a question from a Twitter follower that I'd like to read, and it's specifically about GlobaliD. And that is this. It's this tab right here. This is from Arturo Portilla. Number one, is it in my GlobaliD's plans to offer hosting and or validation services for @payid_org addresses? And then his second question, and you can get to him in any order you want. How does he expect self-sovereign identity to impact AML CFT regulations, if at all?
Right. So help me out a little bit on the first question. I just want to make sure I understand it. Just clarify what he's asking on the first question about the .org and the domain. Was he asking a question about the domain names?
Yeah, well, okay, it's specifically stated he's saying, is it in GlobaliD's plan to offer hosting and or validation services for the pay ID? Are you going, yeah, is there going to be, I mean, I know you were on that core.
For pay ID, for Ripple's pay ID?
Yes, for
Okay.
pay ID,
All right.
correct.
I just want to make sure, yeah. So yeah, we're part of that effort. And so like with let me just answer the first question. So pay ID, it's confirming that anything can move between any two pay ID addresses. It's basically a routing architecture.
Correct.
That's great. What you can think of as a layer again on top of that to make sure that both the sender and the receiver have to, from a compliance point of view, make sure that the other party, for instance, isn't on an OFAC sanctions list or whatnot. And essentially what GlobaliD does is it lets you put in a privacy preserving way the assurance that you've already been checked out. So both the sender and receiver can see that the other party is compliant without having to collect that information or even see the underlying information. They can see who signed. And as long as you trust the signers, now you can use PayID not only to route the transaction, but you can use GlobaliD to make sure that the transaction is compliant.
Right,
and
that
so,
the parties involved are compliant.
Right. So the way I like to say it is PayID is, can I connect the 2 points? And GlobaliD is, should I collect the 2 points? Because there are a lot of things where you could technically connect two ledgers together, but it doesn't mean you should. And so what GlobaliD is instead of having to like if people want to send compliance details with the transaction, that's kind of what we call ready, fire, aim. It doesn't do any good to get the money and the compliance information at the same time. You need to confirm something's compliant before you initiate it. So versions of the travel rule that don't have a way of essentially negotiating pre-approval, you can have the fastest ledger in the world, but if you don't know whether you should use it, you really haven't moved the ball forward. So that hopefully is the answer to the first question. On the second question about self-sovereign identity, we're working both with Sovereign and Indicio to make everything we do self-sovereign. And by that, like GlobaliD itself, that does sound like a centralized protocol. It's kind of like what Network Solutions was at the beginning of the DNS infrastructure. But again, we're not the identity verifier. We're the customer of all the verification companies. Just like Sovereign isn't the identity verifier, they're a protocol that lets parties who are write that in a consistent way. The difference between us and some of these WC3 and Sovereign and other self-sovereign protocol initiatives is we're just a namespace that's overlaid on top. So like the domain name system in the World Wide Web, it's not the internet. It's a linguistic layer laid over the top that made the internet usable not just by universities and governments, but by individuals and businesses. So your name is something that's easy to attach all these other self-sovereign credentials to. And so you can have a form of self-sovereign identity that looks very kind of geeky, blockchain-ish, public-private key. All we're doing is we're cleaning that up, attaching it to a name, making that name like embedded within a phone or a card so it's really easy to present. The other thing we do is if you lose your phone or your card, we let you pick people that are in your address book to help you restore your identity. So once again, you don't have to go to a centralized authority, either a corporation or a government, to basically manage and control your identity. And so we're absolutely looking at the WC3 and Sovereign and other identity protocol standards to be the way credentials are written. So we're just another layer up in the stack.
No, I totally get that. And I am absolutely sure there will be future iterations of this to encompass just how large this really can be. Because like one of the questions that I had when I first got into digital assets was, okay, I understand, for instance, as an investor, if I have a Charles Schwab account and I should pass away, I've signed papers and instructing Charles Schwab that my son is the beneficiary of my
Right.
holdings.
Yep.
Anything that Schwab holds will be immediately turned over to my son upon the verification that I've passed. Well, I get into crypto and I'm thinking to myself, okay, there's cold wallets and hot wallets and you got exchanges and all this, that, and the other thing. None of the quote unquote exchanges that I would keep my assets on offer me a beneficiary factor.
Right.
I didn't see any quote unquote way to do that with my ledger other than to just give my son the private keys while I'm still alive.
Right.
And if you have children that are under 25, you know that that's not necessarily the best idea. Here's the keys to the castle early, son. Please don't, do anything silly. We all know when you're under 25, you have a tendency to do some things that are silly. And it just didn't seem like there was any good option. But this pay ID I could see rolling into some safe haven type system, some form of being able to distinguish, this is me, this is the verification that I've passed, then therefore release A, B, C, D, E, F, and G that's under my name, my GlobaliD name that I have associated to all these different things. Am I thinking in the right way?
You are. In fact, all the language that we use around GlobaliD, like trustee, custodian, agent, it all implies that like if there was no technology, if there was no electricity, no phone, it would be the same principle. We would just do it with a concept of contracts that was old fashioned. But the whole concept of agency, trustees is exactly what you're talking about. And it works on both ends of the spectrum. One is what happens if you die. But the other thing is when you're having kids, like the question is, well, when does a child get a GlobaliD? Well, as a parent, you ought to be able to set it up before they're even born. You just pick the name and you have agency over the account. And when they reach 12, maybe they can use GlobaliD. They can't control their money, but maybe they get privacy over their messages. Maybe not. Like when they get 16, they might get, more, or maybe that's when they get privacy over their messages. But there's a point at which then they would actually get control over their money. And so all these things, it's like smart contracts. Everything is encrypted, but the question is who has the keys? And in the case of when you die, if you have other people that are going to execute your will, they collectively might have the keys to put it together, and then they can take control to execute what your wishes were in the will. And so it's just a technology version of concepts that have been around for years. They're familiar and have worked, but now we just need to do them much more efficiently and digitally and much more ubiquitously so that the people all around the world can do it and can do it like with the kind of like the intimacy that you'd have if you lived in a tribal world, but now our tribe has global reach. And so that really is the architectural and aspirational challenge of GlobaliD.
No, and there are a lot of elements to that that are very attractive to me, being an expat, United
Mhm.
States citizen living in Costa Rica. Um, you know, I could just see many, many applications where this entity, GlobaliD, could play a very beneficial role in the way that I manage and handle my assets.
Yes.
And obviously my identity is an asset. It's, it may not have the same dollar value that a stock or a digital currency might, but believe me, my identity does have value to me. And I know that you have elements of GlobaliD that are, I kind of like to use simple terms, and it's like I can pick and choose with which entity I want to share what information with. That to me, that whole interact and transact kind of on my terms is something that is really attractive, being that Google and Facebook, these behemoth companies, were built on information that I wasn't necessarily volunteering, although I guess I did volunteer because I got it and they
Well, yeah,
monetized it and I didn't.
correct. And they have the underlying private information. Another sort of, it's a subtle, but it's an important feature of GlobaliD is when you get your name, you go out and you collect all these proofs of everything from like your address of where you live or what your phone number is or what your bank account details are, or you might get someone to confirm that you own that ski boat. Like all those things you collect. But then what you share, I mean, you could share the underlying private information, like where you actually live or what your phone number is, but it's better under GlobaliD that say you're dealing with a regulated entity, you share access to that information. So rather than the private information actually transferring, you share access to it. So that third party then doesn't have to actually have your data. They need to have access to it in case they need to file a suspicious activity report. But rather than transferring the data, which is the way like the Europeans envision it happening under GDPR, or the way the Facebooks or the Google, like where folks today that we have are actually holding the private information and they get to decide what to do with it. They tell you you might have some control of it, but if they get hacked, you're kind of shit out of luck. In this world, you've given access, and those companies shouldn't actually use that access until they need it. So we're not allowing them to actually have the data until they need it. And you are the one who decides that. And so in a world where you want to minimize the attack vector, differentiating between giving access and actually sharing the data can actually reduce complexity. It can reduce costs for both parties. It puts you in a more controlling position. And when you cut off access, then your data was never shared in the first place. And so instead of like under the GDPR, the European view, they say, well, when you don't want someone to have that data anymore, you have the right to be forgotten. Last time I looked, nobody had invented a time machine to go back. And so having come from Twitter, like once you say something on Twitter, the fact that you revoke it, it's kind of hard to turn the clock back. And so in our world, we actually suggest don't share access or publicly share the level of verification you've achieved, because that ought to be enough for the other party to like grant you the permission you want, whether it's opening an account or moving value or a medical record or voting. It's the level of verification, the level of trust, rather than actually giving up the data itself. And so that's a subtle but important distinction in the GlobaliD world to minimize the actual amount of sharing of data that you even need to do.
I love it. I love it. Here, let's grab, I put two other questions that I thought were really pertinent. Here's
Sure.
one from Damar Shamini. What would you like to share about hard yucca? Now, from what I understand, this is your investment entity, right?
Correct. That's right.
What an incredible little portfolio you have here. I'm going to read off some names because I'm not going to share this part of the screen, but obviously GlobaliD, App2, Diwala, Coinbase, Uphold, Robinhood, SharePost, Brave, Upgrade. There's a whole bunch more. I'll bet there's a company named Ripple in here.
Yep.
Now, some of us have heard of that. How about Bitso? I mean, this is a who's who in the digital transformation that the world is going through, and under every single friggin' rock is Greg Kidd.
Well, it's kind of a Forrest Gump journey. I mean, hard yakka was actually the meaning of hard yakka. That's an Australian word. Hard yakka is like a blue collar slang for hard work. Oh, it's like if you've been dipping a septic tank ditch or something, and at the end of the day and it's hot and you're sweaty, he says that was some real hard yakka. And I only got the domain name. I thought, oh, I was really lucky to get the domain name. And then somebody said, well, Greg, you got it because you spelt it wrong. Hard yakka is supposed to be spelt with 2 Ks, not 1. So that's how I got the domain name. And that was only after a year that some nice Australian informed me that I'd spelt it wrong. But hard yakka was originally a vehicle set up to hedge my position on Twitter, because I was around at the start of Twitter.
Right.
Jack had been living in the backyard, and I didn't really get Twitter. That's why I'm only user number 62. It took me 61 people got Twitter before me, which is a little bit embarrassing. And but because Twitter did fairly well, then we started reinvesting those funds, and the next thing that came along was Square. And so hard yakka's money is only just money that we've raised. So one of the great things is we can do whatever we want. We don't have to please outside investors. And yeah, it is a little bit of a Forrest Gump story. Once you go to the right poker games, or that's where I learned about Ripple. And somebody said, well, it's a thing. It's like Bitcoin, but it has 2 extra columns, like one for currency and one for who issued that currency. And I said, well, that's interesting. That sounds like a company. It's something I could actually join. And that's how I became that 10th person at Ripple, the chief risk officer. And so all these other things, one thing leads to another, whether it's Bitso or Marqeta was something that grew out of my risk advising activities at Square. And that's now, bumped up to like a $4 billion valuation. It took a while, but it's gotten there. But we have a lot of clunkers as well. We kind of learn from our mistakes and celebrate our successes. But it is an investment company that has a mission, and its mission is to create a world around GlobaliD, a world around self-sovereignty. And so it has a focus on everything to do with identity, payments, and marketplaces. And it envisions a world where we move beyond the Airbnb and Ubers to the DeFi versions of those companies, that with enough credentials, you should have, not that Airbnb and Uber aren't great companies, but you ought to be able to do Airbnb and Ubers in every industry with less and less uptake from a central controller, because both the payors and the payees, the seekers and providers, they all have enough reputational capital, and there's enough clarity in how the money flows from one party to the other, that you ought to have an extremely flat marketplace economy of sort of gig economy workers. And that's the fundamental thesis of hard yakka. There was a time when like software was eating the world. That was an Andreessen concept. We have a view that basically distributed solutions for identity, trust, combined with ledgers, means marketplaces will eat the world, with still a role potentially for some central authority that's dealing with things that go wrong. But for everything that goes right, everybody can just get the hell out of the way. And so anything that looks like that, we'd like to be on the cap table and help that along from an identity point of view with GlobaliD. That's really the mission and mandate for hard yakka.
No, I love it. Now, obviously, I didn't spend an hour going through it, so I'll just ask you the question. Is there an insurance provider type entity you see in your hard yakka portfolio, or one that there's room for if one should come along?
So we are looking to do more on the insurance realm. Like in particular, we've done some insurance. So folks that actually use GlobaliD as a second factor authentication, as an alternative, like an Authy, which I'm also an investor in, or a Google Authenticator. When you verify with something you have rather than something you know, we're much more confident that the assets that are being protected are safe. And so whether you're doing that for bicycles or Bitcoin, we are looking to increasingly get in that. So what we are looking for right now is an insurance company that will insure things that you've actually put on the blockchain, that you've actually like taken photos. So instead of just getting homeowners insurance for like what's in your house and then your house burns down and they're like, you kind of like make up a list of like what was there and the insurance company kind of has to trust it. No, instead you just say, look, this, and this is what I'm insuring. And so it's an insurance company is much more likely to give you a better price when they know exactly what risks they're taking because the assets are explicit rather than implicit. And so anything where the item to be insured can be more clearly described, verified, confirmed, that means a more efficient insurance system, a more automated insurance system. There just aren't many companies that far along doing that, but we've kind of got the door open for folks coming to us with those kinds of schemes. Some of the early things you've seen are some of the insurance, I forget the name of the company, where they put the little device in your car and they can tell whether you speed or not. Like they look at the actual driving pattern,
Right.
and they insure you for the miles driven. So it's that kind of precision in insurance that makes insurance more efficient and more affordable.
Well, I really, having had you on the show now and listening to the way you respond to the questions, it's really easy for me to see that although it appears you have this very wide view, it's actually a very narrow view on the macro outcome of innovation.
Yep.
And that to me reminds me very much of game selection. I'm talking about poker, right? When I walk into a card room and there's 50 tables, there may be 7-card stud, 5-card draw, low ball, Omaha, and Hold'em. Well, that's a lot of options. Now, where do I feel that I have the best edge, right? Well, it's definitely not at an Omaha table.
Yeah, Omaha's tough.
That's a tough game. If I feel like gambling, there it is. But if it's about taking principles and applying them to make money, then I'm going to go to Texas Hold'em.
Yep.
Now, and I hadn't had that perspective about you until just now, that it just clued into me that you do have this very wide macro view, but it's really in a narrow category around this innovation cycle that we're in. So if I know, look back at history, I would say I think you're in the right place and you're doing the right things. It's on now. Excellent description. All right, I've got another question from you, and it comes from Mark Phillips. And he asks, Greg, what do you see in this digital asset industry transpiring broadly over the next 5 years? So looking forward.
So the big thing we're looking for, there's been a battle going on between WeChat, WhatsApp, and Telegram. Those to me are the big three. They're the big messaging apps. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with digital currency? We think it's a lot easier to add money to messaging than the other way around, adding messaging to money. There's a reason why Trump went after WeChat. He's like, realizes that's a real source of power in China. I mean, it's a new kind of cold or hot war, is to actually start banning apps. Just like the SEC tagged Telegram and made it tough for them to launch Gram, and the regulators have been all over Facebook and Libra. All those folks are hovering around the big kahuna. The big kahuna is when there's a global protocol for how we all communicate, and money is just another form of messaging. So if there was an interoperable way that we could all communicate and anybody I could talk to could receive money, any kind of value, then the way marketplaces would work would be in a much more integrated way. Now, I look at WeChat and WhatsApp and Telegram as the equivalent of, in the 1990s, as AOL, CompuServe, and Prodigy. Each of those was impressive technical networks, but they did not interoperate. And in the beginning, they had features that the World Wide Web didn't have. And they didn't take the World Wide Web very seriously. Now, the thing that the World Wide Web had was it was an interoperable global protocol. It didn't mean that there was a Chinese internet and a Brazilian internet. And so what I'm looking for in the next 5 years, and I'm hoping that GlobaliD and some of our ecosystem of companies is part of that, is a way for people to basically communicate, which generally means just plain old messaging. It's like Swift, but for the rest of us. How do we interact and talk? And I don't mean like social messaging, nothing wrong with social messaging. I mean instrumental messaging. You cut my lawn and I want to pay you, right? It's like, hey, I put a bet on from Australia for something happening in Iceland and we need to settle up. When that can happen on an interoperable basis, that's amazing. And so the difference between today and 5 years from now is I'm looking for that standard to evolve. Now, it'll either evolve in a kind of a bottom-up open protocol way, or it'll work out like there's a movie called Demolition Man. And in the future, there's this world where, like, if you say swear words, you have to like pay a ticket. And there's been something called the fast food wars or the wars. And all restaurants in the future are Taco Bell, because Taco Bell like beat everybody else. So, you know, you could live in a future world where Mark Zuckerberg gets his dream and we're all using WhatsApp, or like WeChat and the Chinese take over, or those Mad Max Russians at Telegram. Like one of those it's like Highlander. They think they're going to like win. Now, I think that's extremely unlikely. I don't know how the world's going to actually function in the future unless we agree to interoperability. And so just like in the phone system, you know, now we take it for granted that we own our phone number, not the phone company, and that you can send a text message to anyone in the world. It's kind of clunky and stuff and low, but it interoperates. We don't have that yet for messaging or for money. Aspirationally, that's the direction where we're going. I would have thought it would take longer than 5 years, but with COVID now, we have challenges like, how do you present a COVID credential that you've been either received the vaccine or have antibodies or have a negative test? And we need to present those credentials globally because you have to fly globally, right? And you have to interact globally. So if we can solve that problem, why can't we solve the problem for messaging and money generally? So COVID accelerates that need for us to solve these kinds of problems on a global level, even while everybody's talking about anti-globalism and localism and nationalism. But hey, look, the world still works and interoperates on a global basis. And so I'm looking for us to get closer to that goal. And all those big three I just mentioned, they all have regulatory challenges right now. But the reason there's so much regulatory focus on is that that's the battleground for the future.
Yeah, right on. Hey, let's chat a little bit about regulations. So I am unaware if you've done had any screen time with anybody since the OCC put out their response letter. And so I was going to put two parts to you. One, have you discussed that while I set up a poker game? Would you like to play a little poker and carry on this conversation?
We can talk about, and are you talking about the OCC's like national charter and the bank charter type? Right. Okay. So it's a big subject of conversation. I myself, I'm ex-Federal Reserve. I worked in the payments group at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C. And I worked with a bunch of folks from the OCC, including Gene Ludwig, who was the head of the OCC under the Clinton administration. And so, you know, we've been looking for something from the fintech world that amounts to federal preemption so that we don't have to be running around to 50 states getting money transmitter licenses to get a seat at the table. We've been, the fintech industry shut out for, you know, from the payment system, from direct access to the payment system for years. And so, you know, the Fed charges 0.25 cents for an ACH transaction, and banks often resell that to fintechs for 25 cents, a 10,000% markup. So we absolutely want federal preemption so that we can actually accelerate our ability to innovate on top of the payments and financial system. Whether the OCC can actually get that through, I know they're being sued by a number of states and groups of states. That's just a straight up power struggle. I wish it would happen. If you look at the number of new charters issued in this country, it used to be 50 a year. 15 years ago, it now is 1 to 2 new charters a year. And how can you have 6,000 financial institutions when you're only getting 1 to 2 new charters a year? That tells you you're in a situation that's totally ossified. So we applaud the effort of the OCC to get a charter out there or a way for fintechs to get a charter, it is damn hard, and I would not be waiting on that. It's a little sorry to say, I'm American. I like the weather here in the Bay Area, but I have to admit I've shifted an increasing number of investments and activity outside the United States because it is very, very hard to innovate here in the United States. And so, the bulk of our people are working in just outside the US, and
Right.
a lot of our initiatives now are outside the US.
Right on. That's really interesting. One of the things I know in our community and on Twitter and kind of in the XRP community, you're really seen as this, okay, you were an early investor in Ripple, you've invested in a lot of other things. But one of the things that I think gets lost is the fact that you have been an investor for a long time, and that there are principles that you could share with us that would make us better investors. And that's always a goal of mine and a goal that I try to put forth on this channel. So I'm going to have you talk about poker, but using investment type strategies. So entering a poker game, what would you put down on the table as a starting stake relative to your overall bankroll?
Well, there's, poker is played at two levels. One is you're trying to win the hand.
Right, which we have one right here. You see, we got jacks and we've been raised. What do you think? Should I raise or call or fold?
So I've got to get used to this. Where do I see the jacks?
Oh, you can't see them on the screen?
I don't see the jacks. I see.
Those are my. That was the guy that just raised was me. See, do you see the name? It says Jerry XRP.
I'm looking for.
Oh man, I shared screen. Huh.
I got Hold'em, but I see a whole bunch of different players. I see different games to join.
Oh.
I see open. Do I have to join? There's an open game.
Nope. I thought I was sharing my table with you. See, I've never done this before. What happened? I re-raised the razor with jacks, and the flop comes ace, 5, king. Perfect flop when you got jacks, right?
Terrible flop when you have jacks.
Right. So I'm going to fold. So you can't see my screen. That is
I can't. But I can hear your hand. You get crushed. There's nothing worse than getting crushed with pocket jacks or pocket tens when you get two overcards in the flop.
Right. Well, you know what? We didn't get crushed, Greg. We didn't get crushed because we checked the flop.
Okay.
We checked the turn, and we checked the river. On the river, the initial raiser put in a bet, and I just threw it away.
You threw it away. Okay. You got to sit in the blind. You got to sit.
I got to see the entire table roll out, the flop, the turn, the river.
Right.
And it wasn't worth the pot size bet on the end. So one of the things I'll tell you how I think when I think about poker and game selection and things of that nature. When I'm going to get into a poker game, and for instance, like I'm sitting on a 4-6 suited in spades on the button in a 6-handed game,
right?
5 cents and 10 cents, an early position raised to 30 cents. I have $10. I'm going to call the 30 cents just to see a flop on the button with this suited 4-6. Uh-oh. Small blind just decided to re-raise, make it $1.40.
Well, that's a little pressure.
Now it's a little pressure, but I'm looking at the size of the stacks, and I would say if I hit this hand and I'm in position, the implied odds are that I'm going to make more than 10 to 1 on my money. So I'm going to go ahead and call it. Now the flop, Greg, comes 10-6-4. I flopped bottom 2 pair.
Right. Yeah,
now this guy just went all in front of me for $6.12. I'm going to go ahead and call it because I bet he's on a flush draw. They're going to expose his cards. He's got the king 9 of diamonds, which I was right. He's on a flush draw. I do not want to run this twice. I'm just going to run it once.
Got it.
I don't need any insurance. I just want to see the cards.
You got it.
So just how do I make it just? No, I'm running it once. 6 of hearts on the turn and ace of hearts on the river. We just took down a big pot, Greg.
You just had a full house.
Yeah, the turn pretty much sealed the deal with the 6. Can you see the flop in the turn?
I
No.
cannot.
Gosh darn it. Well, then this isn't happening the way I wanted it to happen.
But I will talk a little about your first question on poker. And so,
Oh, do it. Please do.
so there's playing each hand, but there's also playing for the evening, and you're basically using the hands to sometimes get to know your opponents. And you can play video poker where you don't really necessarily get to learn that much about your opponents, but in real life you're often getting to sit at the table and you're trying to figure out who's a talker, who's a bluffer, who is someone that you can like lose a little bit to for a long time and then set them up. It's kind of like Rocky. He pretends he's like he's a righty, but he's really a southpaw, and he pretends, but he saves that one left-handed punch. And so your goal with poker is to take away the money at the end of the night. And so
Right.
you have to be in a position where you're maybe willing to lose a bunch of smaller amounts, and when you really have the nuts, you need to make it count. And so you need to bluff enough so that they don't think that when you finally do have the nuts, everybody folds and you can't get paid. So all those skills are taught to you in poker. How do you get how do you have that mix of bluffing and basically showing so that you get the reputation established that you want, and yet at that particular time when you want to change your behavior a little bit, and they don't know, that's your period of asymmetrical advantage. And so there's game theory a hand at a time versus game theory over the course of the day versus game theory over the course of your life. And those are three different things, and they don't remain static. And so strategy is something that you can understand mathematically, but in human nature, that's the part that's different. Everything else in physics you can model mathematically, but human nature, we're different from every other creature and every other physics phenomenon. And so theories that work at one time in history are different at another time in history. So what worked for economics during the Depression may not work for economics for the recession. And it's the same thing with both upside opportunity, upside risk, positive risk, as well as negative risk. And so whatever investment criteria that I had that worked 10 years ago, maybe not going to work today. Part of the reason I'm spending a lot more time internationally is I used to be able to be lazy, and all the opportunities, or enough opportunities, were hatching right here in Silicon Valley. I now feel that there's talent much more distributed in the world, and that some of the next most valuable companies are going to come from elsewhere in the world. It might come from China. There've been amazing things that like just examples of like TransferWise and Skype coming out of Estonia, or M-Pesa coming out of Africa. It means I'm looking further afield now for opportunities than I did before.
No, how wonderful is that? Let me ask you a question. I want, before I transition from the poker topic.
Sure.
So in the Bay Area, and since you've got to travel, this will go globally, but in the Bay Area, did you enjoy going to a card room like Lucky Chances or what have you?
Or the Oaks. I play at the Oaks a lot in Oakland.
You like Oakland, in Oakland?
I do, because that's the hood.
It's a nice room. I remember I used to play, believe it or not, a 10-20 limit game there. That was pretty juicy.
Right. Yep.
Back in my day, when that's how I derived my income, was from the felt. The Oak Room, yeah, nice. Okay, now
good cafeteria.
That's true. Excellent. Matter of fact, I remember I would always just take a cab, because I'd go park in the long-term parking, because I was from Sonoma County, so I'd have to drive to the Oaks to play, and I'd take a cab over to the Hofbrau.
Yep.
Now that was good eating, but anyway, we digress. Tell me about some poker rooms outside of the U.S. that you've dabbled in that you really thought were top notch.
Well, I haven't done really much in poker rooms outside
Oh,
the U.S. because I haven't had that much opportunity. I have had I've played some private poker games. Probably the most interesting. There was a New York game, and it was kind of an illegal game. And
sure, sure.
but the most interesting thing I learned about it was this game was kind of it was played with a lot of the folks. This was the courier industry. I don't know if you know the first company I took public was it was kind of like Uber but for couriers, and it spread from New Zealand throughout the world. And it's actually the company that Jack Dorsey hacked into. That's where he got his interest in dispatch. It's where we learned about text messaging and payments, and that led to Twitter and Square. But this poker game, it got to be kind of like notorious. There were a bunch of folks in the game that had played in the world championship, world poker tour championships and whatnot. And I thought it was a risky game because I was a little over my head in that game. But the biggest risk, it turned out, was one day, and the location was always changing. Somebody got the word out, and the poker game was held up, and
Oh,
everybody was robbed. And that was a different kind of risk than I'd ever thought before.
sure.
And so there you have the normal risk of a poker game, but there's an additional risk. It's kind of like in crypto. You have the whole worry about what's going to happen with the prices of crypto. But some of my crypto exchanges, like GateHub in Slovenia, has been robbed twice. And so you get an idea. There's the obvious risk that people have of volatility of like the hands and whatnot, but then there's this existential risk alongside. Now, existential risk can be bad, or existential risk can be good. In the case of Ripple, when I worked at Ripple, I asked for options on the Ripple currency, and some people asked for grants. I said, no, I don't want you to give me any XRP. I just want to be able to buy it. And they said, well, that at what price do you want to be able to buy it? I said, well, I want to be able to buy it at the market price. And like, you want to pay the market price for Ripple? I said, yeah, but I want to lock the price in for 10 years. So that meant I got to have the price determined at that time, or over a period of time, and then lock it in for 10 years. And to Ripple, that didn't look like a risk to them because they were going to get paid the market price locked in. But given how the price of XRP and crypto took off, that was a way, just like we were talking about for betting and poker, of making a relatively small bet. I didn't have to put up any money at the time. When I actually had to put the money up, because it was an option on my side, all the upside was on me.
Right.
No downside. And so looking for situations where you have asymmetrical upside compared to the downside. I mean, I could always tell what the difference was between 0.6 of a penny and zero. It was 0.6 of a penny. But the difference between 0.6 of a penny, which is what the average lock-in price I had for Ripple was, and infinity, that's a big number. And so,
Huge
so
number.
looking for, sorry?
It's a huge number. Are you kidding?
It's a huge number. And so looking for those kinds of situations, people underestimate the value of optionality. And so instead of buying the underlying assets, buying options on an asset, even though it's like a form of insurance or getting those options, people often underestimate the value of optionality. And I do not. So, because what that really says is, because of uncertainty in the world, options pay off really well. And so the great thing about options is you don't need to know what's going to happen. You just need to know that the future is uncertain. And I believe the future is more uncertain than most of us think. And mostly, like, I can't predict it. So that's why I'm more likely to buy options than buy underlying assets. One of my favorite bets for a company is to say, look, I'm not going to invest in your equity now. I'm going to actually do something with a strategic partnership, and you're going to get revenue from me, possibly for an integration with GlobaliD or with Uphold or Apto for cards or something. Revenue to you, expense to me. But what I'd like is, for every dollar I put in, I'd like warrants to be able to put $2 more in at your next valuation. So they get revenue today, I get a tax deduction today, and I double my risk exposure. I still have to put more money in, but I don't have to put it in until I want to put it in.
Right.
And so if the company does poorly or goes sideways, my warrants are worthless. And they say, well, if you had stock, you'd at least have something in the company. I'm like, I don't really want to be hanging around for something that's going to return 1/2 of what I put in, or 1 or 1.5. Like, I'm looking for 100 to 1 or better. And so I'd rather have twice the exposure to 100 to 1 than a safer exposure on a 1-to-1 basis. So those are the types of bets that I make that really leverage up the upside. And yeah, a lot of time I end up like losing my initial stake, but you can lose 40 initial stakes. If one of them pays off 100 to 1 or 500 to 1, you're way money ahead. And so much better to double down on the upside risk. And that's a big thing with poker. Like, where do you get in those situations where, you don't have, like, you're not going to have the winning hand statistically, but the additional bet that you have to put in, and the fact that if you do win, you win so big, the pot odds, as they call it, are what you're always focusing on. Not the odds that you're going to win, but the pot odds of your next bet and what the payoff will be for that incremental bet. And if all you're investing is on that same concept of understanding the difference between the odds that you're going to win the hand versus the pot odds for what you have to pay to still be in the hand, that is my investing principle that is aligned between poker and Silicon Valley style investing.
Let me ask you, which came first? Did you learn it from the poker world first, or did you learn it from Silicon Valley and it was an easy migration into the poker world?
Well, I really sort of started out with there's sort of 3 big realms of risk that I deal with in life. One is poker that we've been talking about, which is sort of the game theory type world. The second is this business risk investing. But the third, and the one I came with first, was just high risk mountaineering situations and bike racing, where you're in situations of actual physical danger. And you have to make a decision. Like when you're on a cliff face and you're climbing and you see a storm moving in, you can decide to like climb faster without ropes because you want to get off the mountain before you get hit with lightning, versus having ropes. And yeah, if you fall, you've got the rope to catch you, but you might be fried because you got hit by lightning. And so we had a saying, which is that speed is safety. Sometimes you have to like turn off the safety mechanisms that you normally would have because you're in such physical or mortal danger that you do things that you wouldn't otherwise do. And so you're making an incremental view of like, I need to take this additional risk to avoid this much, much bigger risk. And so you learn the difference between what we call objective risks, which are things that you can actually, make an evaluation of, and you learn to accept risks because, like not doing so is a bigger risk. And so what I often say when people say, Greg, you're such a risk taker, I say, no, it's not that I'm such a risk taker. It's just that I realize that the risk of not doing something is actually greater than the risk of doing something. And so there's a little poem that I think most people secretly say to themselves, which is, each day I hope and pray that tomorrow will be the same as today. And tomorrow is not the same as today. And so sometimes you have to take a bold risk because the world is going to be different. And so in the boiling frog world, you've heard the experiment where if you put the frog in the water and it just gets a little hotter each day, the frog doesn't jump out. He just boils to death because he doesn't have the shock that he would have if you dropped him into boiling water. He'd actually survive because he'd jump out. We need to be in a situation where we actually realize that we're in a boiling frog situation and we need to kind of turn up the heat and force ourselves to take a more dramatic action, because the real risk is the risk that we're not realizing that we're being boiled to death. And so whether with mountaineering or poker, like in the poker example, it's just you keep calling, and you're getting sucked in. Sometimes you need to check raise. You need to like get in deeper or get out. You need to ask for information that tells you got to get in really deep or get out of the hand. And it's the same in business. You got to like get enough information to, there's no half pregnancy. You're either going to get in and go for it, or you need to get out. Like being half pregnant is not a great investment strategy.
I agree. That is incredible. Okay, I have one last question. about
Sure.
investing. Also looking at the clock, and I don't want to take too much of your time. But it would be like this. So obviously at this, like in poker terms, the stakes that you're playing at now in investing are well out of the reach of 99.9% of the people that are going to watch this interview. All right. However, you weren't born like this. So
Nope.
let me ask you a question about when did you take gains and go and set yourself up some kind of financial security, whether it be a passive income stream, or a reoccurring income stream? Because that's one of the questions I get the most, because I do a lot of stuff around just general investing principles, and that is to take gains and then own assets that pay you to own them, whether they be interest or dividends, or in crypto now we have the whole POS thing with staking and things of that nature, which hopefully will be available on Uphold pretty soon with some of your proof of stake assets that they're holding on there. Did you do that early on? Did you ever
Well, I
turn
made a huge
something
mistake. Yeah, you learn from mistakes. The first company I took public was the dispatch company. It's called Dispatch Management Services, and it was a NASDAQ IPO, and I was the chairman, and my entire stake was locked up in stock for 2 years. I took no cash out of the deal. And people offered, like Goldman Sachs, offered to hedge my position. They'd take some of my position and they would mix it in with other IPO CEOs or chairmen. And I said no. I said I thought it would be disloyal to my company if I actually didn't stay 100% undiversified in the stock of my company. And that was a big mistake. The Russia default came back then. It affected all junk debt. We had a bunch of debt on our balance sheet. It really hammered our share price. And it put me in a situation where, instead of being, financially independent, I had to start thinking about cash flow again for myself. And so ever since then, like when Jack left Twitter, he had a bunch of Twitter stock, and I encouraged him to sell 10% of the Twitter stock, which would have been worth a lot today. But he sold that and he used that to start Square. And Jack has made so much more money from Square than he has from Twitter that it's because he took 10% off the table. So if you get a chance to take something off the table, it will let you play poker or investing or whatever risky thing you're going to do without having to look over your shoulder to figure out how you're going to pay the utility bills. And so it is a very different game in poker when you're playing with chips rather than with your daughter's college fund, right? And so you play better poker, you enjoy life more when you are playing with chips rather than your life savings. And sometimes, look, you have to play with your life savings because you got to get to the next level. But the goal for folks as an investor should not be to get rich. I mean, that's fine, but you need to get to a point where you can put a stake aside so you can play the game as a game, as opposed to something that's going to keep you from sleeping well at night. And so the reason I live my life without stress so much, and I can look back and laugh a little about all the mistakes I make, and I make a huge number of mistakes, is because it doesn't mean that I'm going to be eating, something different tonight because I screwed up an investment today. And so I would encourage everyone to have that as a goal, and to be in a situation that you can also make sure not just that you're secure, but that the people around you that you're relying on, your deal team and whatnot, you need to help them get into that situation too. That financial security, and it doesn't, it's just enough to basically make sure you're not going to be, worrying about paying the bills or whether the kids are going to have shoes and braces. That's a really helpful position and intermediate goal to get to.
I couldn't agree more. There is nothing in the poker world, for me anyway, there was nothing worse than playing with scared money. And when I'm talking about scared money, it's like, oh man, I've just, had 3 bad sessions in a row, like every 65%er that, that I put my money in on I lost, or, you know, I can count 12 different times that 4 outers got me on the river, you know, just bad luck stories. Happens to everybody. It's just part of the game. But to have your bankroll go down and go, oh my goodness, this is just enough to cover the bills for this month. But then there's no way, I can't keep playing. So I've got to make a choice. Do I go play sound and hope that I win? Because you can play the best ABCD, you know, poker in the world and still get your butt handed to you. It's just the way sometimes, you know, the cookie crumbles. And I can remember a couple of times taking that scared money to the casino. And that's when I learned how to, have you ever heard the term chopping up games?
No, I haven't.
Okay, well, chopping up games means I go in with money that really you shouldn't, you know, it's scared money. Getting a profit in the game, like let's say that it's a $200 buy-in no limit game.
Right.
Getting it up to $400 and then cashing out.
Yep. Got it.
Putting that 200 and then taking the 200 that you just won in that game and getting on a waiting list and getting back into another game. That's called chopping. Chopping for profit.
Yeah. The key thing is, you know, so some of my buddies, when I go to Vegas, that they are professional poker players that I've met over the years, and we said, and you know, they tell me their poker stories, and I tell them my stories in the marketplace, and I also take on some of my biggest wins have been in court, where I've won on cases for like access to data, or rights for who like created a particular crypto environment, and you know, I tell them how nervous I get when I'm playing for a hand that might, you know, like a pot that might be $1,000. And they said, Greg, what are you talking about? You just told me the story where like one of my litigation cases is with Microsoft, LinkedIn now, over who controls access to the data. And that's like, you know, that company, which is on the line, was like essentially destroyed. And it's a case over whether it should be recompensated for $50 million with treble damages, 150 million. Like, Greg, that is so stressful. We could never sleep if we had, you know, we're going through these court rulings and whatnot. You've got huge amounts on the line. And I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't bother me. Like, but somehow when I'm at the poker table and it's $1,000 pot, like my adrenaline is going, and they're like, Greg, we couldn't even sleep at night if we were like, you know, you get sued under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act for felony offenses, the same thing that Aaron Schwartz committed suicide over. And that to you is a normal day at the office. And I'm like, yeah, but somehow that, you know, it's like a really good rock climber that's climbing without ropes. And you're looking and like, you know, if you fall, you die. But he's like, yeah, but I'm not going to fall. You know, it just depends on what kind of risk you're comfortable with. And I go to poker because I'm not that good at it, and it tells me and helps me develop humility, and also a bit of a sense of humor. You know, and you've got to have that. If you can't sleep at night, don't be doing what you're doing. Pick something that when you're going to have risk, you know, you can accept the fact that you have good days and bad days, and it's all learning. If it feels like learning, as opposed to like something that is like tearing you apart, your identity, your self-esteem, don't do those things. Find the things that, even though other people think they're scary as hell, to you, they feel like educational, learning, and like you're alive. And your best stories come from the things that went wrong, not the things that went right. And that is still the greatest thing about America. In other places, when you have failures, they think you're a failure. In America, when you have failures, you just have stories to tell. And that is, to me, the American dream. And that's the thing I like to bring elsewhere in the world. They bring all their great cultural things, but the thing that we bring is a healthy attitude towards setbacks.
I love it. I'm going to close out with this, and that would be, after you've passed, right? What would be like the 3 qualities you'd like the world to remember Greg Kidd?
Well, the big thing I'm hoping the world moves forward to is, look, everybody has the nostalgic view. In tribal times, everybody knew everybody like could trust everybody. It was we all had connection. That's the maybe it's made up, but that's our vision of like a time of small town or tribal. I'd like to have the advantage of a global world where you can go anywhere, do anything, but people still feel connected. They can still interoperate on a personal level. And so I'd like to believe that localism and globalism are not fundamentally conflicts. They're just two different enjoyable extremes, that we don't have to be globalists or anti-globalists. We don't have to be like nationalists or anti-nationalists. I want the vision of the melting pot. The melting pot wasn't that we all lost our identities. We could still celebrate our identities, but we could fuse together to be more than the sum of the parts. I want to live in that world in terms of communication, in terms of money, in terms of opportunity. I want to ultimately have an optimistic view of the world. And so what I feel like I'm working on and we're working on is putting in the infrastructure, bits and pieces to that vision. Like blockchain and Satoshi's contribution, that was like one of them. But so have other innovations. Like I feel like Twitter was an innovation because it was like a way that you could, instead of like having power with publishers, anybody could be a publisher. So anything that is democratizing, that's bottom up, like Square let anybody take a payment, Twitter let anybody be a publisher, blockchain let permissionless innovation happen with regards to value. That's the huge innovation of blockchain and Satoshi, was you don't have to ask permission to innovate. That's a great bottom up contribution. I'd like to see those things fused together, so the potential of the melting pot, as opposed to a Mad Max or Orwellian or creepy Facebook future, is in the cards for us. And I don't want it to be a bureaucratic GDPR European construct either. So something else is out there, and we individually and collectively need to get to that. And even though like we live in the middle of COVID and Black Lives Matter, sometimes things have to get bad enough for them to get better. And like right now, if we didn't have COVID and we didn't have Black Lives Matter, we might be looking at another 4 years of something that isn't that great. But because these things got that bad, they might get better. And so that's my ultimate optimism, is that once again, the setbacks and failures that we have, thesis, antithesis leads to synthesis. And I'm hoping to be part of that effort and to meet and work with other people that are working in that direction too.
Wow.
Like you.
No, what a great conversation. I want to wish you well in all of your endeavors, but I'll tell you, to me, you've hit some home runs. There are some projects that you've been involved in that are very dear to me. Uphold, I am such a huge fan of the model versus the rest. Now, I have nothing bad to say about Binance or Coinbase or in any of the other exchanges, but what Uphold has brought to the table is made it so that it's so easy. My father, who's 73, who has no desire to jump into any kind of learning curve, can sign up and get involved, whether it be currencies, precious metals, or cryptocurrencies. And their integration and interaction with the community and PayID and GlobaliD, and they just keep iterating. Great team, bravo on that. Obviously, you saw a home run in Ripple, like I saw a home run in Ripple, and let's hope that they keep doing what they do, because we'll both profit greatly from it. Yep. But also, the human, you're a human being, and you display that very eloquently and humbly and graciously. And I just want to let you know how appreciative I am for the time that you've taken to have this kind of unorthodox chat with me. This isn't.
Well, I hope we get to have the next one over a poker table.
Wouldn't that be wonderful? We'll do that at some point. Maybe I'll figure out how to. By any chance, do you have a GG Poker account?
I don't. I just haven't. Just this year, I made a pledge because I love poker a little too much, so I'm not allowed. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. So
Okay.
I'm doing a little bit of a, a getaway from it, but I'll come back. But I have to hit some of my internal goals before I'm allowed to have that kind of fun.
Okay. Well, when you do, we'll get on and we'll chat just like we're chatting right now, but in play.
Absolutely.
Great. All right, sir. So you're in the Bay Area right now, right?
I am. Muir Beach.
Oh, excellent. And I'm from Costa Rica. So, folks, that was the conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. I sure did. And until next time, Pura Vida.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.